And we're live. Alright, welcome back to the third episode of TMI. I don't know if we figured out what that acronym means yet.
We'll have a new one every episode.
Something like totally something about insights.
Totally.
We'll figure that one out eventually. Anyway, I'm here to welcome you back. I'm joined by two of our co-hosts. I'm Jacob. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
I'm Cyrus. I am also co-host.
I am Carolyn. I'm here, and I think JoJo might be in the room here somewhere too. She's part of our diversity efforts.
Yeah,
She's a dog.
Yeah, we heard the comments and we tried to diversify, so we got a dog. So
yes, interspecies dialogue important.
Yes, definitely. So you might recognize me and Cyrus from the first episode. We were your co-hosts then, and we're going to be your co-hosts again. Just as a couple disclaimers, this is once again our opinions, not a lot of hard fact behind it.
I have many facts.
Well, Carolyn has facts. I have opinions.
Jacob and Cyrus are still in the same position. We don't really know what we're talking about.
Yeah,
this is how we like it.
This is just us talking. So if you have something else that you want to do, or like just want to hear our voices, put something on. Do something else, put this on in the background, and enjoy the show, the ride, whatever you want to call it. So, this one, we're going to be talking about apocalypse scenarios, the future in general, and probably one of the most common not topics, but examples of when people are left on their own to survive Lord of the Flies. So, where do you guys want to start?
Well, we should start with maybe kind of work backwards, let's talk about some sort of common representations or famous representations of what people see the future as, people see or saw the future as looking like, and sort of work our way backwards.
Okay. So pretty common future scenarios in pop culture. We have things like Star Wars and Star Trek. Well, Star Wars maybe not, but Star Trek is definitely a future Earth scenario.
Star Wars is a long time ago. That already happened.
Yes.
It's in the past.
Yeah, the whole...
And too far away.
Yeah. Okay.
Back to the Future.
Okay, Back to the Future, yeah. What else? Back to the Future, Star Trek.
Does Logan's Run count? I'm not really...
Logan's Run.
Not really clear on that.
I'm not super familiar with Logan's Run, so...
Okay. Then we can just not mention that.
Okay.
Well, if we want to go back to literature, we have, we've all recently been reading 1984, Brave New World, or
okay, yeah.
Go back to
and there's stuff.
Other classic.
And in the case of 1984, that is a future scenario that has already passed. So it's not saying that it's not a future that's possible for us right now, but I'm just saying it's not predicted. It wasn't predicted with 2017 in future in mind.
At this point, I think Back to the Future is also...
Yeah, Back to the Future, at least the second Back to the Future
yes.
took place in 2015.
Yeah.
So that's always fun. Yeah, also future, ambiguous future, Fahrenheit 451. Some of the good classics about future and, suppression and all that good stuff, but,
Fun fact, Ray Bradbury didn't intend it to be about censorship. He intended the meaning of the novel to be relevant to television. So, that's just a little thing, you don't decide what your art is about. Once it's made, it's for the people.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Cool. Well, so we've got some future examples, and, kind of on the Star Trek Back to the Future side, we've got,
not entirely pessimistic about everything.
Yes, as you'll find out, most of the people on this podcast tend to look on the darker side of things.
Lots of much of sci-fi future focuses on dystopia.
This is true. Dystopia is very common.
Used to.
Goes hand in hand.
There was a turning point sometime in the 1900s when people stopped imagining gleaming spires and flying cars and all of that and started imagining dystopia with utter control and gritty streets and people with not enough to eat. There was a turning point sometime in the 1900s where people started to think of the future as a dystopia instead of a utopia.
Well, I mean, there's always like dystopian and
Yeah, there was
odd
always
stuff,
the
but
clash.
like I'd say like post-industrial revolution, depression era, like people started to like in general see the future as like messier and more bleak.
And during the Cold War.
Well, yeah, our art and our literature and our ideas are shaped by what's contemporary to us. So, the 1920s and the Cold War were definitely some very dark times. So a lot of what was produced at that time would also be along that trend. You work with what you're given, and there's always going to be people that try to look through that soot and that darkness and find the light at the end of the tunnel. But yeah, for the most part, there are definite turning points where the dystopian future is much more prominent.
And you'll also have those authors during those time periods that just fancy irony, and so they have utopias and things and arts where they sort of contrast the reality they're living in as a sort of escape or maybe statement about the reality.
Definitely. But anyway, so we have two versions of the future, a utopian version and a dystopian version, which...
And there's some mixes, and dystopia is modeled as utopias.
Yeah, and yeah, there are definitely different flavors of this, but for the most part, utopia versus dystopia. And, Star Trek is probably an excellent version of that utopian, future, at least when we're looking specifically at the Society of Earth and the United Federation.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's, maybe not, like, quite think of them as extremes as utopia and dystopia, but more optimistic, pessimistic type things.
Okay.
And Star Trek is definitely an interesting, case study because it's, it's long running and different installments, and
yeah,
you can sort of examine the differences. I guess, to some element you might see that in Doctor Who too.
Yeah.
Like a long running show.
Definitely. But for our purposes, really, it's the the original Star Trek was this idea of like this bright shining future where everyone in the world could be productive, and it was supposed to be this idea of like a perfect society kind of thing. So.
And sort of things being internally on Earth, sort of the problems not. The problems sort of being gone, that, there's the internal conflict is kind of gone, and it gives, the society the chance to go out to the stars and explore, they're no longer fighting with each other. And if you think about the politics of the time it came about, and it was, very important or significant that the original cast represented, different nationalities.
Definitely.
Right.
So
Gene Roddenberry was very progressive.
So one of the topics we wanted to talk about was this optimistic sort of utopian view of the future. How do we get there, and how do we avoid taking the steps of getting towards that more pessimistic, dark dystopia? At least I'm pretty sure that's what we were talking about before we started recording.
I think one of the things I've noticed just from spending too much time on the internet is that, more popular, upcoming genre and, science fiction writing, or just, science fiction theories, theories in general would be a sort of, what would you call it, kind of stemming from, the environmentalist movement, seeing a world where things definitely, things aren't perfect or anything, recognizing that humans and society isn't always going to work towards the betterment of ourselves to help others, but that we can still build good things from that within, our communities. Oh, solar punk, that's what I was thinking of it. Sort of a recent genre. And it's just, obviously from the name, lots of focus on like renewable energies, but it's all sort of focused on, individuals and communities like building something good, not necessarily society progressing, which I think is interesting and probably more realistic.
Yeah, that's true, because many how do we get there questions and sort of like books you read where utopia and dystopia, it's because a sort of giant step has been made in either one direction, like a huge uncovering over something, or like a discovery in science. So like science has made a leap, and suddenly we can do things we've never done before, and we don't know how to control it, and that's how things get out of control. And so but reality is awfully gradual in most cases, and so like it's sort of like a 2-step backwards, 3 steps forward, sort of got that backwards, but it's sort of situation in reality where like probably the most honest answer I can give is, how do we get to utopian future? Just like keep trying and trying with almost all odds against us.
Yeah.
Some of the things you hear about, I'd say a fairly common theme in really like, utopias or dystopias, if they involve like a sort of overarching, government or authority, they often involve like the backstory, involves some sort of like disaster or war, like some sort of room that the new authorities like rise out of.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, in 1984 there's a revolution in The Giver. There's the 9-year war, I believe, in The Giver.
Something like that.
I don't remember it being named.
It was named at some point.
There was some conflict. Yeah, generally in these stories, some kind of event, some kind of apocalyptic event happens, and that allows, these people who think they're doing this for the betterment of their society take power, and eventually it transforms into this thing that's no longer for the betterment of people, but for the suppression and the maintaining of the order and power.
There's sort of 2 directions you could take it, almost. Like you could take it as in, rising up out of the ashes, the people like band together, and authorities, an authority rises out of that, and sort of, it's at any point, like at some point, if the authority becomes too vast, like there's no like original goal at that point. It's about maintaining authority, and then other people look at it as maybe, there's a big ruin, and then sort of, just people rising up. There's no sort of overarching authority, like it's more smaller communities and people working together, and that can be like, although it seems less advanced, it's often like the more positive view.
Yes. Yeah, that's those 2 directions are also why, whether you believe if you think about the future, whether you think about like a utopia or dystopia, it's about how much faith you have in humanity, almost, like whether we're basically good or basically bad. Once you have this earth-shaking event that shatters us to our core, what is that core? What does it contain, and what behavior will we do about it? And of course, it's different for everyone, but like humanity as a whole is what you usually think of when you think of future.
Definitely. And currently, I don't have any sources to back this up, but at least in my opinion, the biggest threat to modern society is the availability of clean water and clean energy, and just a resource crisis that will happen sometime in the near future as we drain our planet of natural resources. So that's,
which is of course totally avoidable.
Yeah, it's avoidable.
It's artificial, really, if you think about it. I mean, I didn't know, like, try not to get too much into this, but sort of, the way, when you're talking about, like, you're considering how much faith you have in humanity, but it's not just that. You have to think about what we do when we come together as groups, when we come together as governments and as corporations and as, societies, like, those, something like that doesn't have the same goals as, the elements that make it up, and the thing about things like clean water and food availability and clean energy is like, these things are like theoretically not really that hard to get, but the way our system functions, like, there's
it shouldn't be hard to fix these problems, but we've created these problems for ourselves that we convince ourselves are difficult, but they don't have to be.
Yeah.
And that's the issue, is because people profit off of, them not being readily available.
Exactly. It's true, the point, like, once you come together as a group and, like, as a corporation, like, how will you act then? Which is why I was like, if something like a war, which is what happens in most of the dystopian or utopian novels, if something like a war sort of brings us all down as equals at that point, then if there's such a war that everyone loses the power that they've carefully brought up just because of this violence, then how does that affect us?
Mm-hmm.
When we don't have those incentives or motivations like money to keep resources away from people.
Yeah.
Or if they no longer can, sometimes disasters. Sometimes you see this more in utopian, so I suppose you could see it as an element of dystopia too, is that, whatever's holding the power, whether it's, people like, disproportionately powerful people, or just corporations or authoritarian government, like, sometimes you see, like, in future scenarios is, that something happens that wakes people up, that this just can't go on anymore, and the power of collective power of people, like, they don't accept something any longer, which is probably more optimistic than a war or a disaster taking those things out.
But it's also, if you think about it, it's more optimistic because and this might just be me being pessimistic, which is something I love, but if it could also seem less realistic, really, because if you see how much people can put up with without saying, like, this is where they need to stop, like, you keep moving the line back and back, and you can see people, or, like, societies doing this really easily, actually, and with almost no backlash. And so, like, when do you stop moving the line back until the line is just erased by some sort of event? So that's
like a really good point about, like, moving forward toward the future, is that we can't, like, in reality, like, you can't expect, government or businesses or anyone to, or society, as a whole, to advance forward, like, if we want to build a future, like, build the future that we want, it's, it takes individual action, it takes, unlearning some of the things you've been taught as part of society.
Which is something that not all people are willing to do, or some people find it hard to do, or some people have incentives not to do, which is the issue.
A lot of people are just pushed away from it too, for fear of, for whatever reason, or just
True.
the general, like, tilt of society. People don't want to say these things because they seem radical or ridiculous, but that has much more to do with the frame of reference you're raised in than anything else.
Yeah, so, to move radically forward, sometimes you have to think radical thoughts, and, sometimes you have to take a few risks and break a few eggs to really, push forward and see how far you can take things. And there's always the concern that you will take something too far, but that fear of the unknown and being scared to try didn't get us where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people, like, fear, on the other hand, like, the idea of, making use of your power as an individual or as a collective, making use of the power of ordinary people, sometimes scares people because they might think, like, who am I to have the right to say how things are decided, and in some ways they are right. Like, sometimes, like, I mean, how many times in history has a government been overthrown to not really be replaced with anything better? But that doesn't mean that, you know, accepting something that's unsatisfactory won't lead to a similar conclusion. Not that I'm advocating overthrow of the government. I would never do that. Ever.
No.
You know,
Of course not.
I love the government and capitalism and the NSA. I really love the NSA.
I wonder how much it hurt to say that.
So, I really do love them.
Anyway, getting a little off topic. But moving towards the future, one thing that a lot of people seem, well, not a lot of people, I have no statistics to back this up, but something that I think people should keep in mind is the little thought experiment, which is the plight of the commons. I don't know if you guys have heard of this at all.
Not by name, could you?
No, but it
Okay.
should be familiar.
For the listeners at home and for my benefit of my co-hosts, the plight of the commons it's a little outdated and it's a little it's not the most applicable now, but it can be. It's basically the thought experiment that in rural England during whenever really small villages would have a central common ground in which people could graze their cattle. So it would
I do recognize this actually.
and that way it would be less taxing on the cows, would be less taxing on their own land, and so you know, this was a great benefit to the community because more cattle could be raised because there was more land and people could share the land. But eventually people started grazing more and more of their personal cattle on this common land, depleting the resources because the fields were being overspent. And seeing that, you know, this common resource was dwindling and dwindling, more and more people would put more and more of their cattle on this land to try and, you know, utilize the last of that resources effectively. And eventually, you know, this common land would become so grazed and so used that it could no longer be used for grazing cattle because all the grass had been eaten or died. So now all these people that used to graze their cattle on this common ground had to graze all of their cattle on their private property, and now they just rendered that patch of land unusable. It's a barren patch. And this can be applied to today if we're talking about, you know, something that just isn't, you know, land to be grazed on. You know, somebody starts taking advantage of something that should be used for the common good. People start seeing that this common resources being expended heavily by a single source, and then they start trying to hoard of this, as much of this thing as possible, thus creating a competitive and untrusting environment. And this is just kind of human nature. A great example of this are battle royale games, or games like PlayerUnknown's Battleground, Fortnite, or DayZ, where the initial games start with a set amount of resources, which is plenty for each player to survive well in. And for those who don't know, DayZ is a kind of like apocalyptic, you know, zombie apocalypse scenario where, you know, I don't know, X number of players are thrown into this map and they have to survive as long as they can. And the initial seed of the game has enough resources to grow around evenly, and each player will have enough food and bandages and weaponry to survive. But this idea that, you know, somebody could be hoarding, and, you know, as soon as we get into the game, somebody will kill me for my resources, or, you know, this idea that somebody else will try and take what should be mine, we start being paranoid and we start playing into our own fears, and we have this self-fulfilling prophecy of, you know, people putting the system off balance, you know, spending too much too quickly in fear that somebody else might get to it before them. And I can definitely see something like this happening in the future as our natural resources get fewer and fewer, because it's already happening now. This there's a lack of mutual trust among people to do the right thing, because history has shown time and time and again that there will always be somebody to take advantage of that mutual trust, which is unfortunate, but it's just the reality of human nature.
There's, like, in relation to that, a lot of people are so worried about, being cheated or something being taken from them or losing something that they deserve, that, they can't sort of, look at the situation at large and see, like, that, okay, this could happen. I could be technically cheated out of something I believe that I deserve, but taking efforts against that will hurt me more. A lot of people just really can't see that in general. I mean that sort of idea of, the idea of being so possessive of something because you're afraid somebody else might take it, even though in reality you have enough. That plays out with money, with capital, and with resources as well.
Power, definitely.
Just jealousy in general.
Yeah,
Great motivator for bad things.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people can't see past they don't realize that what they're doing is more harmful than if they didn't do anything at all. In some situations like that, they don't realize that they're the hoarding and the self-serving, the supposedly the on the surface self-serving actions in the long run hurt them more than if they didn't take those actions and if they took a less self-interested path.
Or depending on the power imbalance, they know very well, but do not care.
Yeah.
Because ultimately they know it will not affect them as much as other people, and what they want now is more important than what they need the most.
It makes me think of, just the need to protect oneself, the need to, feel that they've earned something. And there's so many parallels in today's society. I was thinking about the idea of, support systems or charity or welfare or anything. Like, a lot of people, there's, if you ever talk to people about, giving change to people in the streets, and so many people are like, well, they could, use it to buy drugs, or they could do this, or they could do that, and it's like, it doesn't matter that either way they're giving up $1. To them it's just so important that they're not cheated. And in a political sense, people worry, well, what if somebody takes advantage of the system, and to them one person taking advantage of it is worse than many people benefiting from it.
Yes. Welfare systems and assisting people who fell of hard times seem to be a very contentious topic, and
and very relevant. In 2015, half the people in New York who were eligible for food stamps were not given food stamps because the people in charge saw it as a sort of people holding out their hand for things that they didn't really need situation. So actually, politicians who were in charge of running this made it so extremely complicated that no one was able to actually benefit from it.
Which is terrible. A lot of the time, these people, they want to get back on their feet. They want to, try and restart their lives. They can't because of extenuating circumstances, and they just need a little bit of help, and people are unwilling to give it because...
The idea of earning it, or...
I feel like Okay, so America, it has a different culture than a lot of the world's in the sense that it's very individualistic. It has no communities. We do not live with our parents or their parents' parents in the same household. This doesn't really happen that commonly. America has a high sense of individuality, and your worth as an individual is what makes you relevant or useful to that society. And so that already sort of motivates jealousy in that sense, because you have all of these individuals believing that whatever they have earned. And so that's what makes that sort of sense of community, or these people benefiting off of welfare programs that they don't necessarily deserve, they feel like they don't deserve them because, well, they're fine, and if they're fine, then they've sort of must have made different decisions than the people who are in a worse off situation than them. And so the individualistic sort of focus of the United States, I should say United States instead of America, has sort of encourages people to view helping each other out as possible competition.
Yeah, it's certainly present in other countries, but it's especially present in the United States, I think. I mean, it has a lot to do with when you look at our history and, the formation of the United States as a coalition rather than a country like the system with our local governments and our state governments and people holding on to, being very wary of authority and all that. Like, a lot of it goes back to our founding in general. It's certainly there in other places, but it holds a special place in, like, our culture, like, as a country. Like, it's almost in a religious sense, or ideological sense, but for patriotism, like, we hold these values very close, and we consider them part of us.
Even though they have a lot of negative effects, not just jealousy, but if you just look at suicide rates, countries that sort of have emphasis on individualism, they have higher suicide rates on average because they don't have like a social net to fall back on that they feel comfortable with. Yeah,
this idea that if you ask for help, or if you come to a place where you feel you need help, you're a failure, kind of sense.
Yeah, you failed at something, that's why you need someone else's help. You should be able to do everything on your own.
Yeah.
It's, the idea of working for what you have, and, you get a living because your parents worked so they could support you for as long as you need to get an education or whatever training, and then you could work for your living, and that's how you survive, and that's how you support your family. Like, it's all about, there's like the sense is that when you're helped by others, that like it's charity, they're giving something to you, it's less,
and therefore you owe them.
Yeah, and you discussed earlier, like, our living situations, like the United States has a very like nuclear family focused thing, and didn't always. There was sort of a move towards that in the 50s, I believe, like this sort of idealistic nuclear family. But so the idea that you move out from your parents and you're not dependent upon them, and there's like the whole like the idea of like a village and community, like that's very strange to people. Yeah,
and this is and you can see this like when people make fun of someone else for living with their parents, even if like they can't afford to live on their own. Like that's a bad thing. And you can like humans are social creatures. We're not really meant to be individuals, and this is my hypothesis, but like that's why like November onwards, that sort of Thanksgiving, and then the next few holidays, whatever you celebrate, there's these things. These holidays really encourage community, and people are like, oh, it's my favorite time of year, and it's like maybe that's because like I had on Thanksgiving like a sit down meal with my family and family friends, and we just talked throughout the entire thing, and that was considered a holiday rather than like a regular event that should happen. It's very odd to me, and so that's why I feel like if humans are social creatures, we already feel that this sort of emphasis on individualism is unnatural in some way.
I'd say like building on that, I was saying like the nuclear family, it's not really it's not natural, like it's not how humans really gravitate towards living their lives, and the idea of, two parents or, other relatives like raising children alone in a house, that's like not only is it unnatural, it's not really beneficial. Like, if you think about communal living, there's a lot of benefits. It's better for the safety of children. It's better for people being able to stay on their feet and not, worrying about where they'll get food or other necessities. It's, it's more efficient in ways too, just because you have people working together and not, there are definitely a lot of resources that we have just because, we figure, for sort of things that we might want to use, there are a lot of resources that we collect because we'll use them at some point, whereas, so community can be just naturally efficient in some ways.
Yeah, imagine the programs that we wouldn't need, imagine how the welfare programs would change if we had, this emphasis on community, if we helped each other out and we felt responsible for every citizen of our country. Imagine if we felt this sort of, need to help them because they are a fellow citizen, they are a fellow American, and that's why they deserve it just based on that. You'd have a lot less contention about welfare programs, and you'd need a lot less welfare programs because people would be more willing to help each other out naturally. Imagine if you had that emphasis on community.
Yeah, those are definitely very good points, and I agree that we've kind of lost some of that community sense and that sense of togetherness, especially on some of the smaller scales, and that's kind of just a symptom of today's society and the way that we've progressed, and it does draw back to some of our roots in our founding. A lot of it is just the size and scale of the United States, how large the nation has become, and just how many people, the vast number of people that just live in the world in general today.
Yeah.
So we're seeing populations on a scale that, when these initial systems were developed,
That's your dog input.
Yeah, she has a lot to say about that.
But it just, this idea of communities and, this community togetherness was when you had nations of 10,000 people and you had hamlets of 100 people scattered around the landscape. With such an interconnected and fast-paced world, it gets very easy to lose some of that stuff.
Of course.
That's one of the things I see about sometimes the either more optimistic or just realistic visions of the future and how we move towards a better world is sort of, in some ways returning to more emphasis on community, on helping each other, while also, merging that with this interconnected world, and the idea is that that we all help each other. It doesn't necessarily mean a large nation communist or socialist. Communist really, it doesn't necessarily mean a very controlling overarching government. Maybe it means more power in communities while still maintaining some of that connection.
In Isaac Asimov's first robot book called Caves of Steel, I wouldn't consider it either utopia or dystopia. It's just a possible future, and everyone lives in these cities with a capital C because they're much bigger and more dog input. Just wait a bit. Just a bit more.
They're really passionate about this issue.
Yes.
They don't want to be pulled away.
I didn't know they read the book. Anyway, cities with a capital C because they're on a scale that they hadn't seen before. Everyone in just vast populations are living together, and there is more of a sense of community because it's necessary. Earth actually, thinking about it, I would consider it a sort of dystopia because Earth has sort of deteriorated in such a sense that they need these pockets of people just in order to survive. And so I can see how an emphasis on community would be necessary in dystopias.
Yeah,
or would come about.
Post-dystopia sort of things, we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one thing, not that we necessarily want, some sort of disaster to happen, but if we sort of plan our, societal improvement around that sort of idea, not that, there's no like central like improvements, and we'll all, it's all about technology and central improvements and moving forward into very gleaming, shiny futures. Like, we have to think of it on like a personal and a community level. We, not necessarily thinking, oh, there's going to be disaster and we have to build up our society around that, but that improvement can come in smaller, more individual ways, and it's not all about technology. Sometimes it's just about people learning to, sometimes it's just about improving the lives of people, and that's not always technological.
Mm-hmm. We can emphasize that sort of, we can emphasize that before it's necessary, before it is, or before it.
I think that's starting to happen almost in a way. Like, I'm gonna get into politics. Sorry, but with the current, whole hubbub over net neutrality and the United States political scene in general, and people feeling rather ignored by politicians, I think one of the things that makes an event like this significant is it's really so clear cut. Like, it's so few people making a decision that so many people clearly don't want, and it's the net neutrality, especially because it affects the internet like a lot, which is where a lot of modern like activism, like power to the people, comes from, because it's such a great tool where just anybody really can make their voice heard if enough people want to listen.
True. But
we've started to think, how can we apply this offline? Like, something that I've been communicating with some people about is organizing, maybe not official groups, but just networks of people in communities who want to work at the grassroots level, collective, basically using our power, like, collectively in communities, not, asking or waiting for, the government or other powerful entities to push things forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's a good thing that comes out of a rather unpopular decision, is that people are starting to think, how can we work together? How can we maximize our power? How can we use our power and return our government or our whatever to what we want to see as people?
Yeah, that's actually like a really a big bright side to decisions being made that go against what most of the people want. It's that it does unite people, but good things can also unite people too. To be honest, I didn't understand why we wanted to go to Mars. It's a 7-month trip. That's like one way. It's we pretty much know what's on there from rovers. I didn't understand this sort of necessity, like, oh, we want to travel to that planet just because it's the next thing.
It's
but
human nature somewhat.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, so we need to, like, I didn't really understand it, but multiple people tried to explain it to me, exasperatedly, I assure you, that it would be a sort of uniting movement. Like, look at the next thing that the humanity has accomplished when we work together on this really hard task. And if you think about it as a sort of, if you're ignoring any of the science behind it, and just like getting to a planet, and that would, like, that uniting sort of like the human race as one giant community, like that's
Star Trek.
then that would be a really great outcome of that.
Also, looking towards the future and planetary colonization, if we can learn from our mistakes on Earth, and we find, we can terraform planets, and, it's kind of like moving to new planets is kind of like a soft reset almost, as far as, we can go forward. We hope we can go forward and, colonize and stuff.
And yeah, moving to new planets is almost like a faux version of the war sort of upset thing that we were talking about for the beginning of dystopias or utopias, that sort of thing that erases the line. Moving to a new planet would just be that, but without the, I don't know, the violence, the bad stuff.
Optimistic or, human way of, there's the idea of, human nature and exploration and this idea of, like a lot of, the things about like space programs that people like, and it's sort of, it's like, it's almost, it's pure, it's not really about like politics or anything, literally down to earth. It's about moving forward, exploring, and when you're talking about like some sort of planetary colonization, like there's no like, really, you can't be in a faction, and things like land disputes and that sort of thing, like all that's going to be erased. Like you can't go to a planet and just be like, all right, we're going to like colonize this and not actually work together, because that's what happens in colonies. Like,
yeah, it's such a challenge and such a new experience that you're forced to, it would be a shame to waste such a situation with, politics almost.
Then again, it's still, I hope so, because Lord of the Flies, you could say that same thing. It's a new situation, you need to work together, you can't really vie for control, but that's exactly what they did. And so everyone did contribute, but not necessarily in a good way. Also,
though that dynamic, I feel obligated to mention this every time someone talks about the Lord of the Flies, is just that dynamic, between those boys, like that was, written to really reflect upon society. Like, I think it's one of the differences between like the planetaries, like they're forced onto this, and they're kids, so they don't work together. They want to mirror what they see.
They weren't specially chosen for the mission as people going to New Planet would be. They would be tested for teamwork and ability and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
they
weren't prepared.
Mm-hmm. And they were like, definitely part of it was that these were, these kids were coming from some sort of boarding or some impressive school, so there's, this element of privilege and being like children not being able to, really recognize that. So these, these privileged kids wanting to, and that's one of the things that contributes to just their collapse.
The parallel between Lord of the Flies and going to New Planet isn't really apt, unless you're talking about people who just go to bed and then wake up with like 12 other people on Mars, and they're like, okay, what do we do now?
Then there's also Russia, who might want to colonize like the other side of
There's
Mars.
Definitely, yeah.
True, land disputes between countries, that would be the ununiting factor. By the way, that was Jared. He is our fourth co-host. We swear he has not been swearing. He's not been sitting and listening to us the entire time.
Yeah, he
recently
just walked in, so we'll add him to the conversation.
He replaced the dogs.
Yes.
Slightly more coherent.
Yeah,
but he does make a good point about our disputes extending to, like one of the things we like this idea of exploring so much, and we so desperately like don't want to extend our problems when we're supposed to be working together. But
we could also.
It could also help because of the competitive nature against Russia.
Competition.
We can also take the Antarctica approach and basically proclaim that nobody can claim this, like, what happens on Earth stays at Earth kind of thing.
Yes.
Where it's like, nobody can claim land on another planet for a country.
That'll require foresight. We need foresight in order to get rid of this being a sort of extension of our invasion, and rather than a new land.
I think that's one of the things about, scientific things, like people researching Antarctica or people on the International Space Station. Like, it's not their, it's just them, and they're there because they were sent, and they're working together because they're all working to, they're not here to do any sort of claim anything. They're here to learn, and if you could, you have to think you want to make sure that if we do have the technology and the ability to expand, like, into other planets, that we could like preserve some of this, you know, the original collaboration that would have to come with, you know, the original research and the, you know, the scientific colonies and whatnot. Like, if you could preserve some of that and sort of build outwards than that, rather than people rushing to claim things.
Yeah, and you know, as we move further into the future, no, it's becoming less and less advantageous to use violence as a means to an end, like using violence in warfare as a way to get something. No, just with public perception and an increasingly global world, you know, using wars to, you know, to get something from another nation, to achieve a goal, is becoming less and less advantageous and
A lot more messy and complicated.
yeah, it's messy, it's complicated, and it's not
Eternal. Eternal.
yeah, it's not really applicable anymore.
It's almost getting hit, like, the effectiveness of war and violence and all that. Like, it's certainly, it's probably not going anywhere for a while, but it's, you know, its effectiveness is getting hit at the end of more and more powerful weapons, this mutually assured destruction type thing, and, you know, also on the end of people connecting with each other and wanting to not necessarily just being willing to just not necessarily wanting to, you know, start wars and violence. Like, people are connecting with each other and they're more aware and more individual. They're not simply part of their country or their entity or whatever they're fighting for.
Yeah, this idea of larger army diplomacy is really not going to become a thing of the past fairly soon. So, you know, being able to see past our petty nature and realize what's for the good of everyone is really going to be the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, these things, it's not sustainable, so if we want to avoid being forced to by disaster, we're going to have to start considering how we move forward, you know, start really critically thinking about what we learn about and the world.
Yeah, so so we just broke the 52-minute mark, and that seems to be, you know, the general length of these things. So that
that we would know.
not that we would know, but
we also have, you know, I think this conversation has really emotionally affected one of our hosts, and she is being very vocal about it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So we are going to wrap it up for now, but just thank.
And yeah.
And another co-host.
Yeah, two of our co-hosts have. Yeah.
They've been overwhelmed.
Yeah,
So
we went too broad today. We'll keep it simple next time they're around.
Yeah, they want to explore other things now.
Anyway, thank you once again for listening in and listening to a bunch of people talk about random stuff. Yeah, so
Power to the people, folks.
power to the people. Have
Just
a
kidding. I love you, NSA. I love you.
have
Yeah, fight grassroots campaigns, folks. Work together. You actually do have power, people. Like, yeah, the government, like, yeah, it exists because of you. They work for you, so, like, you know, just in case.
That's not a joke.
You haven't had enough, like, I didn't know if, like, my revolutionary rhetoric was, you know, explicit enough, so I just wanted to, you know.
Yeah. Anyway,
Revolt.
with that one last message from our co-host Carolyn. Well, thanks once again, and have a good one.